good morning, colleagues, and welcome back after coffee for the next session of the conference. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Alistair Jarvis, who is Deputy Chief Executive at UUK, where he has strategic oversight for UUK's communications and political affairs work. He's also Deputy Chair of WONKI. Alistair is going to consider the current political challenges facing AG. So, over to you, Alistair.
Thank you, and it's great to be with you all here this afternoon. When I agreed to do this presentation, I hadn't realised it was the day before a general election. And I think it came as a surprise to many of us coming back from our Easter breaks that a general election was called. And I suppose it's rather perilous speaking to you about political challenges the day before a general election, particularly an election which comes after Brexit and Trump, and an election where the polls are perhaps narrowing a bit. I realised while I was putting this together that I couldn't really do a coherent presentation without making some kind of political prediction, because I'm meant to be speaking about what happens next, and of course it does depend on the election result. So I am going to sort of make at least a sort of broad prediction, which probably won't be a great surprise to many of you, and then sort of go from that premise onwards. So I have a sort of very broad title of what next for higher education, and I'm going to do a sort of sweeping kind of overview, I suppose, of politics and policy that I think is impacting higher education or will do in the months and years ahead. Very broadly, these are the sort of areas I'm going to cover: where I think the politics is at the moment, what I think the priorities will be for a new government, some thoughts on Brexit, what we know, and also, of course, what we don't know, and there's more in the second category than the first. The slide probably now hints towards what I think the election outcome will be, and I'll talk a little bit about the Conservative Manifesto and what that may mean for universities. And then end with challenges and opportunities. And I'm really going to try at the end to say a few positive things, and not to be all doom and gloom, but I have to also be honest that there are significant challenges ahead. So, a bit about the sort of current political context. I think we all probably know there's a general election tomorrow. The reason it was called, lots of people started to call it at the beginning of the campaign, the sort of Brexit general election, which I thought was wrong and didn't really understand the political situation. I think quite simply, Theresa May had a borrowed mandate from David Cameron's election victory and a borrowed mandate from Vote Leave, and wanted to have her own mandate. And she thought, polls are looking pretty good, I can get my own mandate, and then I can really shape policy, cabinet, Brexit negotiations more in my image rather than borrowing other people's mandates. We're, of course, having an election on the eve of Brexit negotiations starting. The 19th of June is when they are formally due to start. Interestingly, the 19th of June is also penciled in for the Queen's speech. So that's quite a big political day, the 19th of June, which is a couple of weeks' time. There's real fears of economic uncertainty at the moment. I think, what does Brexit mean for the economy, the impact of Trump on, global trade. There is also an eye from Theresa May on what's happening in Scotland at the moment. Certainly in a Brexit context, I think it makes Scottish independence, or at least another referendum, more likely. We continue to have a divided Labour Party, although a Labour leader that's arguably had a better campaign, I think, than many have expected, but still a divided Labour Party. So my prediction, and it probably won't be a surprise to many of you, is that the election will lead to a larger Conservative majority. Without going into sort of lots of boring detail, my feeling is that London Labour are probably going to do a bit better than they had thought at the beginning of the campaign, and some of the sort of surge in the polls you've seen from Corbyn is quite sort of London-focused. But actually, nationally, if you look in the Midlands, if you look in the North, there's an awful lot of seats which have small Labour majorities, which had 10 to 15% of the vote last time to the UKIP, and I think they will swing to the Conservatives. So I think you'll see a larger Conservative majority than we currently have. So if I'm right, and that's a huge if and a huge caveat here, if I'm correct about where the election roughly will go, I think we'll see some new cabinet ministers, we'll see some new ministers. It's probably more likely than not that we'll see certainly a new universities minister and possibly a new Secretary of State for Education. What we know about Theresa May in the year she's been Prime Minister is she likes driving things from the centre. If she has a bigger majority that gives her a stronger mandate, she has to worry a little bit less about her backbenches, her small majority. I think we'll see an even more sort of driving from the centre kind of approach. And of course, we have Brexit negotiations that will dominate certainly the first half of next Parliament, and I would probably guess the whole of the Parliament, because I think the Brexit negotiations will only sort out so much of our future relationship with Europe and the world. So, moving on a bit more to what are the priorities of presumably this Conservative government. Firstly, for Brexit. Brexit, there's four big strategic things I think they're trying to balance. Well, three big strategic things and then one thing which sort of falls out of it. Anyone you speak to in and around government, even the very pro-immigration, pro-Remain people within government, and actually there are a surprising number of those in ministerial ranks, they absolutely think that Brexit was a signal that the government has to get greater control of migration. And this government will be determined to try and reduce immigration, but particularly to get more control about who enters the country and leaves, for that matter. There is a real fear, and you hear all the time from ministers' advisors, there's a real fear of economic uncertainty and the damage that Brexit may do to the economy. Although they're not saying that publicly, privately, it's a very common theme. So I would expect a lot of policies that have an economic focus in the next Parliament. Despite many of us, and certainly those of us probably that voted Remain, which I was very much one of, would have thought that leaving the European Union perhaps signals us detaching a bit from the world, turning our back perhaps on some of our neighbours. The government's focus absolutely is to use this as an opportunity to show that we are globally engaged across the whole world, rather than sort of prioritising Europe. So that global engagement, trade, diplomatic strategies is very important. And then I think what has quickly become apparent is there is a greater fear and a greater eye on what's happening in Scotland and Northern Ireland at the moment. The referendum has, I think, stirred up some of the Scottish independence feeling. There's certainly likely to be at some stage another Scottish independence referendum. Whether it then goes for independence is far too early to say. And of course in Northern Ireland there's some real challenges, particularly with the border issue. So I think the sort of breakup of the UK is something no Prime Minister wants to have in their legacy, the breakup of the UK. So I think that's something else to have in mind. And then I've listed there a few of the political and policy priorities. Unsurprisingly, the first three all have a kind of economic leaning to them. Immigration we've talked about. And an interesting, I think there is real passion, and perhaps some would be surprised, within the Conservative cabinet, and particularly number 10, for measures to promote social mobility. And of course there's a certain way that she and her team define social mobility, and it may not be the same as everybody would do, but I think there is a real focus on that, and actually particularly in the Department of Education. Justine Greening, first day in as the Secretary of State, called together all her ministers and civil servants, sat them down and said, your mission is to work out how we can use the education system to promote social mobility. So it's a real sort of personal priority of hers. Whether she stays in post after the election is another matter. So that's sort of thing on that. Brexit. So what do we know, what don't we know? There's far, far more that we don't know than we do know. We know we'll be leaving the European Union in Easter 2019, around that time. Article 50 has been triggered. Brexit negotiations start on the 19th of June. The government's sort of overarching aim, and it keeps getting repeated and repeated by David Davis, Theresa May and others, is to sort of minimise turbulence, so to try and have a sort of smooth exit as we can, and to try and find opportunities outside the European Union, so maximise the opportunities. They did publish a white paper, and it gave us some high-level hints and signals towards what some of their priorities were for Brexit, but there is no formal positions on most of the big issues, and they will start to emerge as Brexit negotiations begin. What we don't know the impact of the very recent French elections to the European Commission's position. It may well be that Macron has an influence and that starts to move the European Commission positions in a slightly different direction. There are German federal elections in September, so I doubt many of the big decisions will be taken until at the very earliest, the mid-autumn. It is unlikely that any of the big decisions will be able to be made from the European side without sort of German input and sign-off. So I think you'll probably wait until after those elections in September before a lot of difficult issues are dealt with. We don't yet know the detailed government priorities for exit, and we don't know the degree of compromise on both sides. So the rhetoric is building. There is a lot of political name-calling and political rhetoric at the moment, but what we don't know is when it actually get down to exit negotiations, whether the two sides will try and compromise or whether they're going to stick to where they are. So Brexit and universities. The week after the referendum results, Universities UK started to talk to our members, talk across the sector on what are the challenges, what are the opportunities from Brexit. And over the sort of summer and early autumn period, we sort of distilled these down into sort of 5 areas that seemed to be the biggest fears. Now, I've got a list in my office of about 100 different issues, so this really is a very condensed list. But the sort of 5 that seem to emerge as most university leaders' priorities were increased barriers to recruiting European staff after exit, increased barriers to recruiting European students, potential damage to research collaboration, the worry of loss of European funding, and the worry of reduced mobility opportunities, particularly if we're outside Erasmus. What I would say is that one thing trumped any of those 5, and the one issue consistently from first week of July through to conversations I've been having this week is confirming the residency and work rights of current EU staff at our universities. And that's something we have in all our conversations, government said that is the thing you need to sort out first. And that is actually consistently, there's only, I think out of every university leader I've spoken to, I think only one had a different priority to that, and I think everybody else had that as their sort of top priority. The other thing which is very apparent, and one of the things we do is spend quite a lot of time in Brussels talking to the Commission, to European influencers as well as to the UK side, is that we've got to continue to be engaged with European programmes. Researchers need to keep putting bids in. We need to be talking about what the future framework programmes look like. We've got to be involved in the policy-making process. Because if there's any suggestion that the UK is, before they exit, starting to back off from these things, it reduces our influence, it reduces our voice, it makes it seem like we are not that bothered about what the future looks like. So in fact, as enthusiastic as we can be with European partners about continued input, I think the better. So how do we sort of address all these fears and these challenges? Well, I should start by saying it's definitely not easy, and it's not an easy political climate to work in at the moment. Broadly, I think there's sort of 3 main phases, and what's interesting is that they all interrelate, and the exit negotiations, yes, they're important, and there's some key things I'd like to see out of exit negotiations, but actually there is quite a lot the government can do with domestic policy to mitigate, to counteract some of the more difficult aspects of Brexit. There's also a real need to ensure stability in the short term and to look at how we transition between membership and whatever the future holds. And actually the transition one is particularly interesting but also particularly challenging because there is a view within government that we should be doing all we can to lay the groundwork for the transition period now. But from the European side, and I'd say perhaps understandably so, what they're saying is how can we talk to you about transition when we haven't discussed what the future looks like? And the European side absolutely see transition as a bridge between A and B. Whereas the UK side is saying, well, actually, can we not look at transition sort of now and we'll worry about what we're transitioning to a bit further on? So there's already disagreement there. I'm trying to get at the moment government to think of it as 4 phases rather than 3. So a sort of stability phase before a transition phase, if that makes sense. So what we have now, how do we ensure there is some stability until we work out what the future is, and then transition to it. In terms of what the priorities are for universities, again, there is a sort of pretty broad consensus across most of the sector on this. And continued participation in Horizon 2020, which is the current research innovation programme, till the end of the programme that doesn't end until the end of 2020. And of course, if we leave the EU in March 2019, there's still over a year and a half of that programme still running. There's then trying to negotiate access to, but also influence over future programmes. There are certain arrangements that we could have that would align us to in some way or give us some access to FP9 and future framework programmes that actually probably wouldn't be very good for the UK. So the access, it has to be more than access, it has to be access with influence that recognises that we are a major research player. Continued access to mobility programs, Erasmus, particularly, but there are other mobility programs that are important too. We need to look at continued recognition of professional qualifications. Not all of them depend on EU frameworks, but quite a lot of them are linked to European programs. The regulatory equivalence and standards equivalence is an absolute minefield, and something that I don't think anyone has probably spent enough time looking at yet, but it's something we need to ensure. But actually, as I said before, exit negotiations are really only part of the picture. We need to look at what domestically is going to happen too. I think it is more likely than not that we will have long-term an immigration regime that doesn't treat European citizens, European staff and students hugely differently to the rest of the world. So I don't see a long-term sort of protecting freedom of movement for European citizens and others. I think that sort of what the government would call a level playing field idea, I think, has really taken root within certainly conservative thinking. So we need to look at how the visa regime can continue to be as welcoming as possible for international staff and students, and where there are barriers, minimise those as much as possible. International research collaboration, whether we're within EU frameworks or without, we need to look at how we can grow international research collaboration. And in fact, even if we do stay within European programmes for research, I think there's an awful lot the government could and should be doing to increase international collaboration, working of course with the sector on that. And actually the final increased public investment in research and innovation, we are starting to see that now. The government has at last committed to getting us off the bottom of the G8 for public investment in research and innovation, and I think there are some positive signs in that area. And although those look like an awful lot of challenges in a lot of difficult areas, there have been some reasonably positive signals at a high level from government on some of the issues that matter to universities. So on research collaboration, these are sort of direct quotes from the government's white paper on EU exit. And on research collaboration, they were pretty positive about the relationship with Europe, the importance of Europe being connected with European partners. They were left the door open to potentially trying to negotiate access to programs. On talent, the only sector that was mentioned in the immigration section of the white paper was the university sector, and mentioned positively. And the importance of EU staff and students to our universities was specifically mentioned. They didn't mention banking, they didn't mention agriculture, they didn't mention skills gaps in other parts of the economy. They did mention universities. And EU citizens currently working in the UK, there's been a long-standing commitment that the government will try and address that first in exit negotiations. Unfortunately, I see quite a big gap between the European position and the UK position on that issue at the moment, but I think there is will on both sides to try and find an early deal on citizens' rights. But, and this comes with a big health warning, these are positive signals. None of these are policy, none of these are formal commitments. These are very high-level things, and when we get to exit negotiations, things could get a lot more difficult. And what we're really trying to do at the moment is get the government to move from a position where they're talking relatively positively about some of the issues to actually agreeing some negotiating positions and some detail in some of these issues. And in fact, even if what they agree is to ignore everything we've said, then we need to talk to them about the alternatives and what we do there. And I think we're in a bit of a period of limbo at the moment, but I think things will move very quickly as exit negotiations start. This slide deliberately is in small text, just really to emphasise how many unanswered questions there are. And these are just three of the big areas: staff, students, research. There are so many different questions that are unanswered, a lot of which I would be surprised if are answered even within the full 2-year negotiation period. I think some of these questions may end up being dealt with post-negotiation, not even during negotiation. And I won't read them all, but I'll share these slides. And we shouldn't underestimate the political challenge of all of this. I think in recent months, the chances of a sort of acrimonious divorce have grown. There are huge differences on what the budget settlement will look like, the sort of divorce bill as it's known. And that's a real problem, not only as an issue in itself, but it shapes what the future relationship will look like. So let's say we get to a stage where the UK only agrees to pay 50% of what the Commission wants us to do. The chances are then the prices for anything in the future go up, because what the Commission will look to do is recover what they feel they were owed from the divorce bill by putting up the prices for future access of things. There are gaps on citizens' rights, and that's a challenge. There's no clear answer yet on the Northern Ireland border issue, and they're the three sort of likely to be the three things in phase one of the negotiations. So I think we're going to see phase one could go on for many, many months, possibly even years, and I think it will look at budget settlement, citizens' rights, and the Northern Ireland border, way before we even start thinking about programmes and future relationships with programmes, and even how we exit current programmes. There's lots of unhelpful political rhetoric, and I've put two of the juicier quotes from the sort of May Juncker discussions recently, and their quotes to the media. There is a joke going around that the one thing May has agreed is she's going to take the cost of the Downing Street dinner with Juncker off the exit bill, because it was such an acrimonious event. I think there is some possibility of no deal, although I think in a sort of perverse way, I think that's part of the sort of negotiating position, and I think showing an election campaign that the UK is going to take a tough stance on these kind of issues. In fact, it's almost impossible to have no deal, even if you have no access to any of the things that some of us may think is a good idea. You need to have some basic agreement on certain issues. So it's unlikely there will be a complete collapse, I think. And even if there was a formal collapse, there would then need to be some interim things put in place. We're putting a lot of time and effort into our relationship with European partners, and ensuring that we have very strong relationships bilaterally with European partners, between leaders of different universities. We spend a lot of time with our European rectors organisations, the sort of University UK equivalent in other countries. And what's great is the message we consistently get back from them is they want to have close collaboration with the UK, whether in Europe or not. And there is certainly very little sort of, if any, ill feeling between the sort of UK higher education sector and those sectors from the decision to leave Europe. What we're of course trying to do is encourage them to tell their governments the same thing and say, we want to negotiate a Brexit which allows participation in some of these programmes. I'm going to move on to sort of another key document, and if I'm right and the Conservatives do win a majority tomorrow, and possibly a larger majority, these things will matter, because this sets out at a very high level what the sort of priorities are for the next Conservative government. There were some really challenging things in the Conservative Manifesto for universities, and I'll come on to some of those, but I don't think it was completely hopeless for us. There were some areas where there was some positive signals too. On research innovation, there was clear signals of an increase in funding there. There's already been a recent increase, and I think there was a commitment to further increases in the future. There was a real focus on universities' local and community roles, which could be a double-edged sword, but actually does show that they understand that universities are absolutely core to driving local economies, to having positive impact in local communities. And I think there is a space there for universities to come forward with interesting ideas about how they can further their local role. There was a commitment to replace regional development funding, which currently comes from Europe, in some sort of form, this thing called a shared prosperity fund. There are a lot of universities that have very important part of their funding is that regional funding, and there's a commitment there. Whether it's positive or negative depends on your opinion, but the fact there was no mention of TEF, I thought, for me, was actually quite a positive thing, because it probably signals that we're not going to get huge amounts of additional new policy in that area. I'm not at all saying TEF's going to go. I think TEF is here to stay. But whether we end up going to a subject level TEF, whether we end up looking at some of the trickier future development of the TEF, I think is possibly less likely, because I think if the government as a whole really wanted to use TEF, what we've got at the moment as stage one, they would have mentioned at least, they would have mentioned something positive about that. Whereas the fact that it wasn't mentioned at all perhaps suggests that there will not be a huge drive to do too much more in that area. There are some real worries in the manifesto as well, though, not least on immigration. Very clear signal that students would stay within net migration targets, and that they would look at further tightening of the student immigration route. There was a very strong focus on vocational education and the promise of a review of tertiary education, which would include universities, FE, adult learning, and other things. Apprenticeships would sit potentially some parts of apprenticeships linked to that as well. Now, I think this is, again, a sort of double-edged sword for universities. I think we've got a real opportunity to prove that it is universities that are driving workforce skills. If you look at the expansion of universities over the last 25 years, the vast majority of the expansion in numbers has been in vocational education. And what I mean by vocational education is degrees that have a clear link to a sort of career path or a job. Accountancy, law, nursing, teaching. And yet, on the other hand, the review of tertiary education could see a lack of recognitions for universities' roles and skills, and instead new vehicles to promote skills. The new institutes of technology, which have been mentioned, could be a threat or could be an opportunity for universities. I like to think that universities could host and lead their development. There may be others who think that they are genuinely entirely new organisations and institutions which should be there to challenge universities and possibly take students away from universities. These are a few of the sort of key lines and a few of the positive and negative things in the Conservative Manifesto. As I said, broadly positive on research, a number of signals on research and some commitments. Difficult on immigration, but actually a little bit of a confused message on immigration, because there was a line talking about the importance of attracting leading scientists. There was another line actually about how they're committed to attracting international students and developing international campaigns to promote Britain as a destination. And yet at the same time, making very clear that students will stay in net migration, and also toughening visa requirements for students were also commitments. There's a whole interesting area around how universities are involved in social mobility and their responsibilities for schools that I won't go into in detail, but I think expect more pressure from government about how universities contribute to schools and contribute to social mobility. And I've already mentioned the Institutes of Technology. If we move slightly away from the politics and onto the sort of policy that we know is in place and know is happening, there are three things I wanted to sort of highlight as particularly significant for the year, 18 months ahead particularly. We know the Office for Students will soon replace HEFCE. What is very interesting about, well, I think it's quite interesting about the Office for Students and UKRI, the two big new sort of players in the sector. You know, the new competition-driven regulator and the new umbrella body for research, is that there's no blueprint for either of them. So we have a higher education bill that gives some, mainly relatively high-level powers to these two organisations. The higher education bill gives them both a name. It says they're going to have a board, and it says they're going to have the chief executive. The chief executive, one has been appointed. The chief executive, the other, will be announced, we expect, in the coming weeks. But actually what those organisations look like, their culture, how they interact with the sector, is still a blank sheet of paper. So the next year, I would say, arguably more important than a lot of the things I've said on Brexit and the Conservative Manifesto. One of the priorities of the sector in the next year is to influence the setup of those two organisations and how they operate and how they work with universities. And of course, we've got the Teaching Excellence Framework results coming out expected next week. So institutions, I think, will get them on Monday, and Wednesday they will be published publicly. And we'll then see what effect that has on student decision making and whether there's future development in that, policy development in that area. One thing that you probably will have noticed is that there was a late commitment to by the government in the end stages of the higher education bill to review the Teaching Excellence Framework. That review will start really soon. I would expect it to start, I would expect a chair of that review and possibly a review panel to be appointed pre-Christmas, and the work to start very soon. It was quite a major concession by government, and I think that it will have quite a big role in shaping what the TEF looks like in the future. I think it was an acknowledgement that the TEF it was an acknowledgement that the TEF actually already, even before the results are launched, has had some impact in terms of encouraging certain institutions to have a different sort of focus on teaching. But at the same time, it was absolutely a signal to say, we're happy to consult and think about what happens next rather than drive ahead. There's a consultation on the REF ongoing at the moment, and then we're likely to see with the Office for Students some moves to further encourage competition, possibly new institutions, which we'll see what shape that takes in the months and years ahead. I'm just going to end with a few thoughts on trying to pull all that together in terms of what are the challenges and what are the opportunities for universities. In terms of challenges, my big worry, what I'm putting a lot of thought at the moment, is how does this sort of certain type of conservative vision coming from sort of Theresa May and probably a lot of it from Nick Timothy, who's her Chief of Staff's head, of sort of a post-Brexit university, post-Brexit sort of Britain, how do universities fit into that? Can we both be both global and local? How can we show that actually our global links also have benefits on local communities? I think linked to that, there is a fear, there is a challenge of will we be putting the barriers up as we leave the European Union? Will we be increasing other barriers to international collaboration, whether that's attracting staff, attracting students? And also, what are our competitors doing? And if you look at international students, for example, the UK has pretty much held its numbers over the last few years, but it hasn't grown it, whereas all of our competitors have grown. The global market for international students has grown hugely. Others have taken advantage of that, so our market share is falling. There is almost certainly going to be new competitive pressures for universities. You know, this is nothing new. We've all been working in a very competitive environment for a long time now. But there will be potentially increased competition, possibly new providers, certainly internationally for students, but also possibly from the sort of vocational technical education sector in some ways, particularly if the government puts a greater focus on that, potentially more money into it. I'm also a little worried of the sort of creeping use of slightly casual phrases like leading universities, world-class universities, as being distinct from other things. So the sort of differentiation in the sector, treating some universities differently from others. We don't know, there's no formal policy proposals in that area, but in my experience, a lot of policy comes from one line of someone's speech, one line in a manifesto that doesn't really have a detailed meaning, and it sort of evolves from there. And I've noticed a lot more over the last year the use of the words like leading, world class, to try and say actually different parts of the sector aren't that. I think we'll see a more interventionist government in a number of ways, and there will be a bit more of telling universities what to do. So I think we have to be careful that where our autonomy is important to us, we protect that. And I think we have to prove that we're part of the solution to a globally engaged Britain, improving the skills of the workforce, having impact on local communities, striking trade deals, rather than being seen as sort of part of the sort of problem. You know, we're not just part of the liberal elite, we're actually central to the future of Britain. And I said I'd end with something positive. I genuinely think there's lots of opportunities for universities in the coming years as well. Universities surely should be the antidote to Brexit. We're globally engaged, we have strong impact on local communities, we drive local economies, we attract innovative investment. We're about developing skills locally, nationally. We're perfectly placed to play a huge role to ensure that Britain can thrive outside the European Union rather than suffer. The industrial strategy gives us a big, broad framework to promote ideas, to show what we're doing and what we can do in the future on the economy. The industrial strategy, the structure of it was interesting. It set out a framework, it set out some pillars. Most of those pillars had a very clear link to what universities do, whether that's innovation, whether that's infrastructure, whether that's jobs, whether that's skills. And yet there's very little policy behind it. The government has invited organisations across Britain to suggest things on how they can further the industrial strategy aims. I think universities are really well placed for that. We are anchors in local communities, of course, and I think we have to do more in that area, but we have some great stories to tell. The renewed focus on social mobility should be welcomed by universities and is something we have a big role to play in. Research and innovation funding is going in the right direction, and all the signals are that the government is serious about continuing to invest in R&D. International development is a sort of strange opportunity for universities. Whether the government committing to continuing the 0.7% of GDP ring fence, the likelihood is that they will spend that money very differently. So the money will still be there, ring fence for overseas development, but how it's used it will be different. And there's a real focus about moving away from aid in terms of cash and looking at other kinds of ways of capacity building civil society. And I think there is likely to be opportunities for universities in that. And lastly, the whole trade, export, diplomatic space. We are wonderfully connected across the globe, and I think universities have a huge role to play with there. We're doing some work at the moment about looking at how education and research could play a part in free trade agreements. There are some excellent examples of other countries that have done that, where they have linked in flow of international students, research partnerships, and other areas like that, using their universities as part of that sort of trade export strategy. I'm going to finish there. I hope some of that was at least interesting, possibly even useful in parts. I'm very happy to take questions on any of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions for Alistair? A question at the front from Anne. We'll get a microphone round here.
Hi, it's Anne Rossiter from SCONUL. Hi. If we were to believe the commentators, education is now a marker of an important social division in the UK, but also in other democratic societies, with the sort of the liberal elite who are rootless, internationalist, pro-immigration on the one hand, and the less well-educated who are anti-immigration, pro-Brexit, but locally embedded. Is this, how do you view that narrative, and how does UK plan to deal with that sort of that perception?
I think that's possibly our biggest strategic challenge. So that's what sort of links all this together, and it's about, can you be both global and liberal, and also care about your local communities and have impact? I think there's lots of ways we need to address that. I think one is to try and show that we have answers and solutions to some of the issues the government is concerned about, rather than just opposing everything they're trying to do. So that's really, really key. I think we need to show better where we already do some good things in that area. So the huge impact that universities have on local communities, the jobs they create, we need to show what local people in local communities are saying about their universities, which is in many areas extremely positive. I mean, we've done regional polling, for example, on international students, which shows that not just nationally, but actually, if you break it down by region and into some local areas, there's huge support for international students. So I think we have to try and connect that local to that global better. But also I think we have to be welcoming or open to new ideas and new suggestions as well. So for example, there is currently pressure for universities to sponsor schools. I think it's absolutely wrong to look at that as a black and white issue that all universities should be forced to sponsor schools. Absolutely not. But perhaps our response should be a little bit more creative than just saying no. And rather it should be saying, what more can we do with schools? How can we show better what we're already doing with schools? Are there different ways we can work with schools? So in fact, coming back with alternatives rather than just trying to oppose. So that's sort of the space we're in at the moment. But it's not easy. The other thing I'd just add is about allies and others as well, because we are not isolated in this. So yes, within number 10, there is a different view of the world to I think you would find across most parts of the university sector. But actually, across Cabinet, there's lots of people who think pretty similarly to us. Certainly across both houses of Parliament, there are hundreds of people who have similar things. Across the business community, there are local enterprise partnerships, foreign embassies even. Sometimes they're some of our greatest allies. So there are others who perhaps sympathise with us. And I think encouraging some of those voices to talk about some of the issues we care about as well is helpful. But there's no magic bullet. It's not an easy place to be.
I think we have time for one more question, if there is one more question. Yes, Roisin.
Roisin Gwai, University of Portsmouth. Just picking up on that and thinking it through, sponsoring schools, interventionist government, so it may be that we're required to. And on the other hand, how do we fund that from student fees. Students are increasingly consumers.
Yeah.
How do we square that? And have you any feeling that the NUS are going to be picking up on these things?
I think the NUS will pick up on some of these issues. I think certainly the local community impact area, we work with the NUS on a number of areas, and actually there's a lot of common ground. As soon as you move past fees, there's actually quite a lot of common ground on quite a lot of these issues. I think on the school sponsorship thing, actually, I should have slightly sort of caveated this by saying that there was actually a change in the Conservative manifesto that was sort of missed by many. The government have been saying they'll basically force universities to sponsor schools. The words they used in the manifesto left open a different arrangement as well. So I can't remember the exact words they used, but it was not a we will force them to. It was a slightly caveated thing. So I think they have heard that there are various different arrangements. On the sort of link to fees point, on the sort of spending student fees on it, what I've heard from numerous university leaders is quite simply, if they were forced to sponsor schools, they'd have to reduce their other kinds of engagement with schools. So there is a large university in the northwest of England who is currently working with about 500 schools in their region. Their Vice-Chancellor said very clearly to me that if we were forced to sponsor a local school, we'd probably have to cut our engagement with those schools in half, because the staff time, staff resource and cash that we're putting into schools engagement, we don't have lots of spare cash elsewhere. So we're going to have to do that. And I think the government is starting to quietly listen to some of that. I don't think they want to do a U-turn on it, but I think they may be a little bit more flexible about how it's interpreted. I certainly hope so.
Thank you very much, Alistair. I think we probably need to draw to a conclusion now, as it's time for lunch. So thank you very much. Can we thank Alistair again?